All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Not Overthinking. This is a very special episode. If you're a regular listener, you'll know that we very, very rarely have guests on the podcast, but we've made an exception this week, and we're very happy to be joined by Professor Jason Blakely. Jason, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. I really appreciate the invitation.
Awesome to have you. And so, if you listen to, I think 2 episodes ago, we talked about a book of Jason's that I recently read that I've been raving about to everyone. It's my go-to birthday present, probably for 2024, is going to be just giving friends this book. And we talked about it, briefly a couple of episodes ago. But now we have the man himself to help us dig into the topics, which we'll get into in a sec. A quick bio on Jason. Jason is associate professor of political science at Pepperdine University in California. He's written a few books. Most recently, We Built Reality, which is the book that we were talking about a couple of episodes ago. And he has a new book coming out in March called Lost in Ideology. My interest in Jason's work mostly comes from his sort of expertise, analysis on, I guess, like the modern ideological arena and sort of how to make sense of it. There's a couple of notable philosophers, Charles Taylor and Alistair McIntyre, whose works are very hard to penetrate if you're a layperson. And Jason has made a lot of those ideas more digestible. And so that's kind of how this got started. I think, Jason, I followed you on Twitter, probably last year at some point, and at some point dropped you a DM. I think I asked you, should I read your new book or should I stick to the old one or something? And he said, I should read the new book.
I said, it's wonderful you want to read any of my books. These were some good DMs. Yeah.
Nice. Awesome. So look, I'll try and sort of summarize what my sort of high level understanding of your main shtick, and then curious to kind of dig in and get your thoughts and have sort of a rough idea of a starting point. So,
sorry, before we do that, can I just ask a very noob question? What does a political scientist do? And what is political science?
Yeah, well, actually, that does get into my main shtick because I don't think political science. So, and often in the UK, it's referred to as a politics department, which is the older form. I'm within that motley band of scholars that just studies politics. And then some people think they're doing science, and I don't really think they are. And I'm in the sort of heterodox view. I do political theory, political philosophy, history, political thought. But what we're all sharing as an object of inquiry is what the heck is politics and what's going on with it. And some people think, well, we can do a science to figure that out. Yeah.
Okay. And at what point did it turn from politics to political science? Was that 50 years ago or something?
Oh, no. Yeah, it was probably the early 20th century in the United States. It was kind of, different histories, but it happened to a lesser extent in Europe and the UK. The United States is kind of the home of, we'll turn this sucker into a science and we'll crack all the problems kind of a thing. But it's a global movement to make it a physics or I have a friend, I should say as an aside, who is a natural scientist who says, you never add science to something that is actually a science. You don't need to read people that physics is in fact a science. But with politics, this anxiety exists, right? So hence political science.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, I think Ali, you mentioned a similar quote last time. So yeah, look, it seems like your shtick is basically hey, in popular discourse, we have, for whatever reason, which probably we'll get into, we have this idea that there are these things called facts on the one hand, and that there are these things called values or ideology. They're sort of factual statements and normative statements, so statements about value and what one should do and stuff like this. And I think where we are now, there sort of seems to be that everyone's kind of agreed. Look, everyone's got different values. We're very pluralistic societies. We're not going to agree on the value stuff. Let's just talk about the facts stuff. And so in public discourse, everyone claims to be talking about the facts. So I was like, hey man, I'm just talking about the facts. I'm talking about the science. This is what the science says. This is what the fact says. But your shtick is basically that these, this move is basically smuggling in actually a set of values and an ideology that can go unnoticed if you're not paying enough attention. And on this podcast, one of our favorite topics is sort of Psi-ops in general. Are you familiar with this term Psi-op?
I don't know how. Through you, actually, Tamor.
Oh, okay.
Okay. It's warfare, right? It's a metaphor of
yeah. So I think psychological warfare. Yeah, I think it's originally from that, but people who spend too much time on Twitter basically use it to refer to any kind of sort of covert agenda to like manipulate you without you realizing, something like this. And so, it feels like your shtick is basically, look, social science is, probably some of it is good, but it's a massive psyop right now, and we need to kind of rethink how we approach this whole topic. Is that roughly correct?
Yeah, it is roughly correct. I would say that a couple things just to so everyone who's really worried that I'm one of those people who doesn't believe in facts. I do in fact believe in facts, whether they believe in me or not. I'm not a radical postmodernist.
Right.
My problem really has to do with the study of human beings, the social and human sciences. That's where the nature of facts gets a little bit trickier than first meets the eye. In the natural sciences, if you say there's one moon orbiting the Earth, that's a fact, okay? Or like the flat Earth thing. But we have a different way of relating to the social world and to social reality. And it's not completely observer independent in the same way. Like if I get the moon wrong, if I get that the Earth is flat, wrong, I get that theory, and pick up the wrong theory, nothing changes about the world out there. And so I think there's a basic distinction between the natural and social sciences, because a lot of what we built reality is going on about, and some of my other work is just that in the social sciences, if you make a descriptive theory, it can actually enter into and change social reality in very profound ways. And in that sense, we sort of dwell in our theories. And the other thing I wanted to say, though, if I can briefly, is Psi-op is a great metaphor. I see it on Twitter. It's a very cool term. And since Taymor kept using it, I was like, I better look this up. And I'm good with that metaphor. It's a wonderful metaphor, with the big caveat that if it's a psyop, it's one we're doing to ourselves. So my biggest shtick is, and I'm not the first one to come up with this, but my little obsession is that modern people have a very specific way of being superstitious, and we do it to ourselves. It's not someone doing it to us, which is, we're so impressed with the natural science revolution for very good reasons. It's amazing. It's made all sorts of advances in medical science, which I know Ali could speak to much more authoritatively, but physics, et cetera, all this stuff. But we therefore think that it can explain everything, including social reality in the same way, our ideological and moral quandaries. And so we tend to build a false form of authority around science where it's not applicable. So I really think the psyop, if you like, or the self-mystification, the self-psyop, the mass self-psyop, is we kind of dance around a certain like fake authority that's pretends to be scientific, but it really isn't, which, more could be said about.
Yeah. Okay, nice. Yeah, I think that's a good distinction, because I think that the psyop is like you said, we're kind of doing it as much as other people are doing it to us, and the authorities are doing it to us, and so on. It seems so. One of the big things that you kind of attack in your book is economics. And I think actually probably like a couple of years ago, Ali, I don't know if you remember this. Correct me if I'm just making this up. I'm pretty sure I've said a bunch of times on this podcast or outside of this podcast that like it's kind of weird that we think about pretty much everything in quasi-economic terms. Have I talked about that on podcast, Ali, like in previous years?
We've done about 200 episodes, so I can't quite recall. So
okay,
for listeners who may not have listened to all 200,
I think partly why like the ideas of the book really resonated with me is because I've sort of had this sort of weird feeling about all of this stuff for a few years, and I've kind of felt like, it's kind of weird how we think about most things. We describe most things as like optimization problems and stuff like this, and like the dating thing about, you should date a pool of people and then 37%, this kind of thing.
Algorithmic dating. Yeah, that was a book that was quite popular here. I don't know how it did in Europe, but it was huge here in the United States.
Yeah. I'm not sure how well the book did, but I think the idea, everyone, like, it comes up at parties often. Oh, they've done the maths and they've figured out the optimal way, kind of thing. Let's maybe start on the economic side specifically. How far back would we have to go for the algorithm? If someone came out and said, look, I've done the calculus, and you should date a bunch of people, and then 37%, whatever the thing is, after the 37% of person, you choose the next best. How far back would we have to go for someone to think, what the hell are you talking about? Rather than, oh man, that's so interesting. That's like they figured it out,
Yeah, well, there's the long story, and the long story is you'd have to go back to the natural science revolution, because the minute that gets going, or like within very short time, people think, well, this is wonderfully successful. Let's apply this to human beings. So everyone from Thomas Hobbes saying he can make a machine out of the state, or later versions of this that are quite popular. People know about them as pseudosciences like phrenology or that kind of a thing, right? So like a science of human intelligence by measuring skulls or whatever. But there's a shorter story about why economics, because economics is the latest in a bid to sort of say we're the queen of the social sciences. We're the really scientific one. And that probably happened along with different ideological transformations that had to do with a kind of vaunting of the free market and a polemic against the state, and that the state was always ineffective and always sort of inefficient, and that markets were more efficient. And they kind of went in tandem with each other in a kind of looping effect, where the reputation of academic economics, like the popular version of this, of course, free economics, that how markets explain everything, like everything you do, right? Like from who you date to sumo wrestling or whatever. Economics is like a kind of imperial science of human behavior. And that is a much newer story. It probably goes back about 50, 60, 70 years to neoclassical economics and the formulation of a kind of economics that looked really mathematical, with models and statistics. And so it looked a lot more like a social physics than some of the earlier bids on a science like sociology or psychology started to look like they were kind of mucking around in problems they couldn't resolve. And at least economics could give us just a kind of mathematical model for how people behave.
Yeah. I mean, I think like this is kind of my layperson's understanding of economics, and I think it probably matches most people's. I would have thought like, yeah, I mean, obviously economics is about like trying to model society and the economy and stuff like this and predict some stuff. Like, what were people doing in economics before like 70 years ago?
Well, there were many different rival schools, and that's one way to know that there's something amiss in the human sciences is that we don't have what you could call like a normal or consensual science. Like if you go to chemistry, you go to physics, you'll learn certain basics, and everyone knows they have limits. Like you'll learn Newtonian physics, and yeah, everyone knows in the back of their mind there's Einstein, there's relativity. But in the social sciences, economics included, there isn't a consensus around what even the basic concepts and objects of study are or how to explain them. And instead, what you have is rival schools. And that's true both in the sense I was just saying that different branches of social science will make a bid on saying we're the queen of the social sciences. Psychology explains everything, or economics explains everything. But it's also true interior to those disciplines. Like if you take a psychology class or an economics class, you'll actually learn that they're rival, especially psychology right now. There's like behaviorism, there's Freudian, which is kind of out of vogue, but has had a slight resurgence recently. There are different theories that are actually incompatible with each other. Economics got really dominated by this neoclassical, very mathematical model building school that has a theory of rational choice, and humans as always calculative and egoistic about 67 years ago. But before that, it was a lot more kind of historical sociological. There was one school that was like that. So if you go read the great economists of the 19th century, like Karl Marx, or even honestly Adam Smith, there's a lot more sort of accounts of sort of historical case studies and empirical stuff that modern or neoclassical economists anyway would say, hey, let's just build a model about a rational actor and then bang out the math on what will happen, or build the model to see what will happen when someone is rational in this economic sense, that they maximize their preferences and all this. But the thing is that this whole thing about like free economics, it was at a high point, but it's really coming down because of a rival, but behavioral economics that says, no, everyone's predictably irrational. People aren't rationally economic, and that's a rival school in economics right now. But it's to the point of there is no normal science the way you get in physics or chemistry, where people aren't questioning like the periodic table or the basics of Newtonian physics. They have a starting point they agree on. Then debates happen later down the road, but.
Okay, so in the natural sciences, oh yeah, go on. Yeah.
Sorry, so something like Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. What's your take on that? Because that to me seems pretty legit. He's won a Nobel Prize. Every self-help book I've ever read cites loss aversion in some way or another, or prospect theory, or like losses loom larger than gains, and all this sort of stuff. And a lot of his ideas seem to have sort of made it into the blog posts that I would read and the Twitter threads that I would follow. So what's your take on that sort of scientific approach to like behavior kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, my take is partly that, because he is part of this whole school of behavioral economics that's a backlash against neoclassical economics. So, neoclassical economics, dominated for decades, was just humans are rationally calculative, they maximize their choices. The reaction to that was no, 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 look at humans psychologically, and they make all kinds of irrational choices. They can't calculate well about their pocketbooks. I mean, maybe if it's very simple, but they often make there are patterns of error cognitively that people have where they have kinds of mistakes they make over and over again. And in fact, there already should have been trouble, because if we were just naturally, spontaneously, mathematically economistic, the way that neoclassical economics said, you really shouldn't have to study it. It should come very easily, because you should be really just studying your own thought process. So in one sense, I'd say to this like new school, great, wonderful corrective. But in another sense, it's got the same problem, right? And if you look recently, there's been a big blowback against people like Dan Ariely, who's part of that school. His book, Predictably Irrational, not only for issues around sort of like whether the research was well done and can be reproduced, but also around some of the predictive claims, that people really are irrational always in this sense. So, I think we need a better picture of what human beings are to make sense out of why from within rival schools that are trying to say we've really got the science of human behavior, everyone can see like what's wrong with the other rival school, that the other rival school doesn't, the emperor doesn't have any clothes on, and that there are limits, to what they're saying. And so I think the real problem here is philosophical. Honestly, it's a problem of how these different groups are thinking about the human person. So I give like two cheers to that school of thought, Ali. I would say like, well, wonderful. You showed that we're not predictably rational in the way that neoclassical economics said. But now you're saying that we just are responsive to nudges in this predictive way, and that every time you build in a nudge, that we'll respond that way, which is also not true. So humans are a little more mysterious, and I don't mean that to sort of mystify the human, but it doesn't fit that model either. It would be part of my answer.
But surely they're not saying, hey, every time you nudge someone in this way, they'll behave this way. They're saying, hey, if you nudge enough people this way, they're more likely than not to behave in this particular way. And it becomes at least my understanding of this is that it's more of a probabilistic thing. Yes, of course, everyone is different, but on average, there are patterns that you can tease out, which are, interesting at worst and useful at best in terms of informing how you design an app or how you design public policy or things like that.
Yeah, and so there's a wonderful example at the beginning of Cass Sunstein and Thaler's nudge, which is, it's kind of stupid, but it's unforgettable, which is this urinal example in the United States where they put these flies at the bottom of all these urinals, because what they found was that men, when they'd go in to pee in the urinal, had a cognitive bias to peeing on the fly. And so like the janitors had to clean up a lot less if they put the fly in there, right? So this is an example of, well, statistically, yeah, won't the vast majority of men start aiming for the fly instead of whatever the hell else they were doing before then? And here's my beef with this. My beef with this is not, so you might get a statistical analysis of men going into bathrooms and doing this, and oh wow, look, we've proven that men always pee on flies. But what that neglects, and here's my substantive alternative take, is that humans are cultural animals and they're self-interpreting. And what we're always trying to get around is our agency in the interpretation of our meanings. And so imagine a culture in which the fly is a sacred symbol, right? And the fly is it's like a religious symbol. And then suddenly all the men are peeing on the floor because they don't want to pee on the religious, deity of the fly or whatever. Or imagine a situation, this is very American, where the libertarians figure out that this is Big Brother trying to get them to pee on the fly. So everyone starts peeing off the fly again. And then your statistical model's gone, right? You see what I'm saying? Like something doesn't work anymore. And so what you really need is a cultural story to explain why people do what they do. So like the statistics might track for a while, but then you get these like situations that disprove the theory, right? And so in other words, what you don't have is I think the mistake that's happening over and over again, one pattern of mistake is we'll have an impersonal mechanistic explanation that can forego people's meanings, their stories, their self-interpretations. And so the mistake that both those schools of economics are making is they're trying to they're trying to ape the natural sciences. They're trying to sort of say, look, there's a sufficient set of conditions that are impersonal, and I can predict what'll happen next, like a scientist. But since we're cultural animals, on my view, this always sooner or later blows up. It doesn't work because we're just not that kind of a being that always mechanistically responds to a stimulus or always behaves rationally according to our like pocketbooks or whatever the alternative theory is.
Okay, so if you read a book like, okay, let's say, I'm not really convinced of this. I'm just like I'm a normal person. Jason, you're up in your ivory tower at Pepperdine, right? You're writing your philosophy. You're reading these books that I wouldn't be able to understand these books that you're reading. Probably even some of the books that you're writing. I read like Thinking Fast and Slow, and yeah, it's kind of helped me conceptualize the way I think. When I'm if I have like a gut reaction to something, it's made me more mindful of it. I'm like, oh, that's my system one thinking. Actually, I don't know, I haven't read the book, but I've kind of absorbed enough of it. But like, it's helped me kind of check myself and not get too caught up in, when I'm being impulsive or something. Like, why can't you let me have that, man? Like, what is what yeah, I guess, why can't you let me have that? Why is that actually bad for me and bad for society? And like, you're right. Maybe 20 years from now, the cultural narratives will have changed, and like it'll stop actually being practically useful. But it's practically useful to me today. So firstly, like, why is that bad? And secondly, like, what would you like if you were writing Thinking Fast and Slow? What's your alternative?
Yeah, well, first of all, if you like Thinking Fast and Slow, I do think you could hack through We Built Reality for what it's worth, because it was written for a popular, all the academics told me it's too popular, and then all the lay people are like, this is too academic. So I don't know. The book is in a weird
No, I
place.
thought We Built Reality it wasn't very academic. Like the rest of your stuff is way more. Yeah.
Yeah.
I can barely understand the rest of it. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was meant to be sort of helpful to people across the board, which sometimes means it's helpful to no one. But yeah, what I would say, I mean, that's a wonderful question, Tamor. Like that's a great question. Like why can't we? And part of me wants to say, well, the way that social science usually works, the reason anyone finds it plausible at all is usually picking up on something that is true. But in what way is it true, right? So take like neoclassical economics, right? Like, okay, I can predict what people will do because they have a preference schedule and they make all their decisions like it was their pocketbook, anything, like who they vote for, it's the economy, et cetera. And part of me wants to say, well, we live in market societies, to your point, and a lot of people have modeled their own thinking to have practiced daily at being just economistic. They think that costs more than this, so it's rational to buy that. And or to your point about, like, what about the piece of advice there about, maybe checking myself in this way? And sometimes there's good common sense advice that's laden inside the social science. But what I would want to say on the level that it's bad, first of all, it's not true in the way we think it is. So it will eventually, it's self-defeating in some way and is very limited. But worse than that is that we're not aware that what we're doing is a kind of cultural ethical exhortation. We think we're just doing science. And that's where the Psi-op, like, if you like, is happening, where we're being superstitious. I mean, we're really evoking an authority that's not there. So, and there I want to say everything is sort of dangerous. So take the dating example you brought up earlier, because I talk about that in We Built Reality. Algorithmic dating, which is the basis for things like Tinder and swiping and whatnot. I mean, you could look at that, and if you read people who defend it, they say, hey, we're finally allowing you to be really scientific about finding someone you love. Like here, the algorithm figures out criteria that you're into or that most people like you are into. It has everything to do from physical appearance to educational level, interests, blah, 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 blah. And you can swipe, and this is like an efficiency and rationalistic form of matchmaking that is, goes far beyond anything any prior culture could dream of. And so it's more scientific and it's helping you be more rational. My answer to that is that theory that's supposed to be just descriptive and helping me understand my potential mates or my potential, future spouse or whatever, is actually itself a new kind of set of cultural practices that displaces and is in rivalry with other forms. If I view people as a cluster of swappable features or qualities that I can maximize, I'm already in a certain stance vis-a-vis them. I mean, And then we can have the debate, is that good or bad? But let's first discuss that it is a cultural or ethical stance. It looks to me slightly shallow and consumeristic to treat people this way. And I think people feel that malaise when they use Tinder. Not everyone, some people love it, but some people feel really depressed by it, right? They feel like they're being objectified and maybe like they're objectifying. And so we're displacing other forms of courtship that take into account, for instance, the singularity of a person. I would, if I were going to have a debate with someone on romantic love, I would say that even destroys or corrupts the ability to be in front of a person as a singular event that I don't have total control of or total understanding of, you know? And so my beef there is there's this kind of scientistic, really dystopian thing that's being introduced into culture. And people are just taking it as this is a neutral tool. This is just helping me do the same thing better. No, it's not helping you do the same thing better. It's changing the thing you're doing. And in fact, it'll probably lead to you being worse at sticking with people, worse at loving people. That's my take on that. So yeah, and I have similar problems with a lot of the practices around these supposedly scientific theories.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think it would be helpful to dig into this, because I think if someone is listening and they haven't read the book, they're probably, I think everything we've talked about so far is like relatively theoretical. I think the dating example was good, but even then, it's hard. I think if you're living in that world, it's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine. Okay, like how else should I conceptualize stuff? And so, yeah, what else? What do you find are like the most, for like lay people who you talk to about this? Like, I don't know, if like Thanksgiving or something, and your mum's like, "Oh, Jason, like, what are you up to these days?" Or what are you researching or something, right? Like, yeah, what are like the sort of the examples that people find most convincing of like, hey, this thing that we think that seems neutral on the surface of it because it's just like scientific or something, there's actually, it's actually guiding you toward a set of values that you may not be aware of and may not actually want to be kind of, pushed towards. So what are some of those other things that people,
Yeah, I think a big one is, for instance, the way people say, well, I know how you're going to vote because of your demographics. Like, okay, you're a white woman, you will vote, for this party.
Yeah.
People never self-narrate this way. They never say, well, I voted for this candidate because I'm a white woman. Like, that's
Right.
just a bad reason. It may be that there's some people who vote because, but this is very thin. Usually, if you ask people, why do you have that political conviction so intensely? They want to tell you a story. And they usually want to tell you a story about what's right and just and what's gone wrong and et cetera, et cetera. And so the idea that what does the explanation is just some brute facts about you, some social facts explain your actual political position or convictions, is not something that I think almost anyone self-applies. We're very comfortable applying it to others. Oh, you did that because you're white working class, or because you're a minority, or because you're gay, or because you're Christian. We do that to other people, but we don't actually say, I don't know why I voted for that. I guess I'm just, upper class credential delete, and it just kind of ping, I voted that way, right? Like, no, we think we have reasons and a story is, and I could have chosen otherwise. And in fact, the truth is we all can vote against demography. I mean, I think it's been a real scandal here in the United States. And, but, the whole Trumpist phenomenon is, it is ultra nationalist. It does have some very bigoted, to me, really repugnant aspects for what it's worth. But what's even more shocking is that some working class people who back it, like right now, Hispanics are realigning around Trump, even though Trump says all these terrible things about people on the border. So if you just had a view that your social facts should explain your behavior, that just explodes your mind. And a lot of people who've taken on a kind of technocratic view of politics are frequently disappointed because they keep waiting for the great realignment toward liberalism, because everyone who's XYZ becomes a liberal sooner or later, and they don't. They become something else, right? So it's part of what I would say is we don't self apply it very often. If someone asks me why I fall in love with someone, I won't say, well, I'm a cluster of these features. We don't self apply the theories. We're very comfortable applying them to other people, not ourselves.
Yeah, for sure. But it seems like we're talking about two kinds of thing, right? Like, it seems, the sort of the commentators and, Nate Silver and these political predictor types, it seems like the thing they're trying to do is like do the predicting thing. And I haven't looked into this, but they might say, look, what you're saying is right, Jason. Like, obviously, people aren't voting for that reason, and maybe it's just about like, hey, what is a what does it mean to explain a phenomenon, right? Or like, what does it mean to have for this to be a cause, or whatever. And obviously, a lot has been written on that, but they might just say like, look, I'm trying to just like predict what's going to happen in these things. I'm not saying these people don't have stories. I'm not saying these people don't have reasons, but like, yeah, it feels like there should be room for this kind of statistical approach that
Mm-hmm.
I think dominates all. The statistical approach seems to dominate all of the discourse about pretty much anything. It's like, hey, we looked at a bunch of data, these things like correlate or whatever, and something about R squared or whatever, and like, therefore this thing is going to happen, something like, isn't there room for that kind of approach for certain types of things? And then for other kinds of things, like obviously understanding and sort of, having an actual explanatory theory. It just seems like we're talking about different things there.
Well, yes, I think statistics are incredibly valuable. My beef with Nate Silver and those guys is they think the statistics explain, whereas I think they just describe stuff that we need some story about. And
Okay.
and the point in my favor is they keep spectacularly getting it wrong, like badly, horribly wrong. I mean, social scientists have not predicted any of the major events that have shaken Western societies in my lifetime. I mean, the collapse of the Soviet Union, a bunch of Sovietologists didn't even see it coming, not even close. The 2008 recession here in the United States and globally, the 2016 elections, and so on. So they don't predict. It's a performance. But the statistics are incredibly valuable because it gives you a snapshot of like a frozen picture of a very thin account of what's happening out there in the world. So I'm not anti-statistic, but here's the thing. Again, and this is a big thing in We Built Reality. How does the Psi-op work? We live inside our theories. We think of the theory like in the natural sciences. I'm describing the planets. I'm just giving statistics here. Like, calm down, Jason. I'm just giving statistics, right? But here's the thing. We are actually world making, I call it. Okay, it's jargon, but like, we're actually creating a kind of social reality that's gamified, where we listen to Nate Silver over and over again, and so and we think he's going to predict something, and we start having this very shallow discourse around politics is basically a game of alignment of demography, and we're playing this kind of like game of point scoring. And so what drops out in a democracy at that point? If you just listen to the Nate Silvers, everyone goes on mute. We don't have their stories or why they think the way they do. Now, why is that a problem? One, it leads into a gamified view of politics where electioneering and manipulative propaganda are the way in which politics are done. So it inaugurates a kind of world or set of practices. My wife's a journalist. I wish journalists would stop just reporting the scoreboard over here. This might be an American problem, might be parochial, but scoreboard, scoreboard, scoreboard. Where's the long form interview with the person you don't agree with? Where's the ethnographic cultural sense of what's happening in the town you don't live in? Americans are complete strangers to each other right now, which is why we're about to tear ourselves apart, or in the process of tearing our democracy apart, because it's not very dialogical or democratic to just keep scoreboard keeping and assume that there's a kind of social determinism behind the scoreboard where no one can change their mind because it's all determined or explained by. That's my beef with Silver and these people is, one, they don't have predictive knowledge, and two, the social facts they're appealing to don't explain. They don't explain why someone votes the way they do, and that's a huge problem. It's not a tiny problem. It's a problem for how we cover elections. It's a problem for how we think about what's going to happen next. And I really think I really think it's one point in the unraveling of American democracy that we play this massive irrational point keeping game, gamified, and CNN loves it and Fox loves it because everyone just watches the game, but we don't have a dialogue. We don't have a substantive debate, around things. We don't listen, really. We don't have dialogical cultural forms of storytelling as part of our discourse very much anymore, at least in the United States.
Okay, so it sounds like your beef is not with the fact that statistics exist that happen to show that, for example, I don't know, 70% of white educated women are more likely to vote for person X than person Y. It's the fact that someone has made a career out of reporting that again and again and again, and the news cycle has made a career out of reporting that again and again and again. to the point that it sort of drowns out any more interesting discourse on why did that person vote for person X and that person voted for person Y kind of thing?
Yeah, that's part of it. Definitely is that it's world making. It creates a kind of cultural reality. So it's another one sense in which this is the psyop dimension that I want to kind of subvert is we dwell in our theories. So a descriptive theory. Marxism has some descriptive theories, but then it inaugurated entire worlds like the Eastern Bloc. We do dwell in our theories. So we've got these theories that pretend to be scientific, but they're actually cultural. They suggest a set of practices, et cetera, et cetera. That is part of my beef. But part of my beef is philosophical with Silver and these people. What we need to explain human behavior is a story. If we want to know why 70% of white women are voting the way they are, we need a story about that group, which, by the way, won't capture necessarily in its meanings or cultures the 30% that don't. So we can really self-mystify if we think white woman is explaining much of anything at all. What the real explanation is, okay, why did women post third wave feminism who got jobs at blah, 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 were in the workplace, blah, 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 seem to align with liberal politics for the following reasons, blah, blah, blah. But we need some story about why it resonates. The shorthand is really self-mystifying, and it's doing us a massive disservice because then we approach a white woman with all these expectations, or a black man, or whatever it is, like a gay person, and we expect you must have politics A, B, and C, and they don't. And so we're really bad at interpreting social reality. So my beef is it doesn't explain. It's more description, and it has a potential ideological function, which is it can open up a new social reality with new practices. So it's a double beef. It's a beef about world making. It's a beef about they think what's explaining it is they're just going to correlate, and then one day it'll be causal. They'll finally have the causal, the goal, the grail of like the social sciences, which no one has, which is the final causal law that always explains human behavior, right? But all they have is correlations, which might be valid to a point, but aren't explanatory or causal. And whenever the causal inference is made, it's just a matter of time before that causal inference is wrong, because we're not machines. We're humans that are self-interpreting. So we don't work that way. We don't work like click. Our bodies work that way physiologically. That's why we need medical doctors. But our cultural lives don't work that way, is my view.
Yeah, I guess you do hear about these heuristics a lot. Like it's yeah, I think I'm kind of sold on this idea that, look, this is basically just like a description. It's a heuristic. It's not actually sort of an explanation for something. But I think where okay, so I think the move here is basically that someone might say, look, Jason, you're right. These aren't explanations. But we're running a democracy over here. We're running, the land of the free and the great, or whatever it is. And like, we do need some heuristics. We need some heuristics, Jason. And what we found is that if you are an immigrant from certain countries, it really correlates with this, and that's why you shouldn't be allowed into the United States. Like, where is that logic? Like, I think so. Someone listening to what I just said, I think many people listening to what I just said would just think, that's kind of like, it's kind of sensible, right? I mean, if X% of Y is this, then, and like, what is like bad about it? Yeah, I guess now we're talking at the sort of top down level where you're managing a company, or you're managing a sort of country or something. You're one of the bureaucrats. Like, what else are you supposed to do?
Yeah, I had a friend in grad school. I went to UC Berkeley, who said, and the invasion was happening of Iraq at that time, and Bush had all these experts come in that were game theorists and all this other stuff. And my friend is like, if you were running this war, would you want to have a game theorist or some social scientist who's an expert in democratic theory, or would you want to have someone who actually speaks the language, understands the religion, and understands the culture? So I have a rival sense of who should be listened to more, which are humanists who understand the cultural languages. I have colleagues who think, in my little branch jargon, again, interpretive social science, hermeneutics, who think, get rid of statistics, get rid of quantitative. I don't have this view. I think quantitative is good. It helps us. I just think people have, first of all, endowed it with an authority it doesn't have, because they've made a philosophical error and assumed that we're mechanistic. And so one thing is, their predictions will always end up wrong and exploding in their face. Someone will come up with a rival paradigm of science. So those are very good reasons to not completely strap yourself to that way of life. But two, to the world making point that Ali was bringing up, it would look very different, the social practices, if people took on board what I'm saying. You would have statistics. It's very useful to know, for instance, how many Americans own firearms, right? Like that, I want to know that. And we're like armed to the hilt over here. But that only takes you so far. It's a very thin form of social knowledge. And so I would want to know, I would want a kind of cultural expert, like my friend was saying about the Iraq War, that understands what the anthropologist Clifford Geertz called local knowledge and thick description. Like, what are the actual stories and cultures people are coming out of? And that doesn't happen during election time or for the economy or anything like that here. Oh, can I give another example actually about the economy? Because that's a big one where it does a ton of damage, right? So when We Built Reality, I go on for a while about the object, the economy. Okay. And this one I think is really palpable for readers because the economy is something we all check almost like a horoscope, right? And what is the economy? We think we know what it is. We say the economy is doing poorly, the economy is doing well. Well, what is it? It's a set of statistical indicators around like consumer confidence, GDP. It's a bundle of things. But it's something we all imagine, that there's this thing, the economy, it's either doing well or poorly. What's my beef with it? What's not in the economy? What is not included in the economy? Housing, right? Like housing crisis, ecological devastation. So we all imagine together this thing, the economy, as this objective thing separate from us, but we've turned it into this object that we let govern who we can vote for, what we ought to do next, what policies are on the table or not. And there's certain things that are just never described in it. And yet it's treated as neutral. You can say, well, the economy shows that you could never possibly vote for that candidate, or the economy's just fine, even though, we've got Skid Row here. I'm near Los Angeles. Skid Row is the largest homeless population in the United States. It's a massive encampment. Oh, but the economy's fine, right? And so you can have basically entrenched poverty, and the economy doesn't catch that. And so you have this false sense of like a neutral indicator, right? Mm. So yeah, my problem with it is, you can keep going this way, but first of all, you'll never get the prediction you want. It's not actually doing an explanation you want. So you're being sort of superstitious, a little bit like a magician in the past. But also, you're actually doing something that is potentially, at least be aware of what you're doing ideologically and politically in terms of the practices around looking up the economy every morning and not looking up the other aspects of social reality, or not even measuring the other aspects of social reality, not paying attention to the other aspects.
So why isn't it then just a problem of like, hey, we just need better models. We need more variables. We need better models. Like, yes, agreed. It's not very predictive right now, but we just need a few more models, a few more variables. Jason, we're almost there. Why is that? Why is that wrong?
The reason that's wrong, and that was to the point you opened with, is because, first of all, the world is an inexhaustible data trove. You can datify it. It's marvelous in that way. I mean, you could never but there'd be data you'd never want to know, like how many hairs are on the leg of a ladybug or something like that, right? And there are things like that socially too, though, like how many people walk their dog around the block in this city, in London at this time. I mean, you could imagine a social political situation in which that became a significant question, but for the most part, that would be a complete fool's errand to gather data on, right? And so my thing with the data is never quite what it appears, which is data always involves an interpretation of what we find significant. And what we're really bad at, and what we've become almost like only half human on, is interpretation and stories. There's always a story driving the data, and I got myself in some scuffles here in the United States around the pandemic issue, even though I was totally on the side of the vaccine, listening to the medical scientists, et cetera. But what really started to irk me was precisely that data was being presented as though it was value and interpretation neutral. And it never is. Even what data we look for, we always have a story. We just might not be good at telling it or telling others that we have it. That's the Psi-op again. The story is always there. Like the story is there. We can't get rid of the story. And then the question is, what data is relevant? Is the data that's relevant GDP, or is it that there are homeless people in downtown LA? Like, what's the relevant data,
Yeah, I think COVID was an interesting one where I think there was this sort of, yes, science was with a capital S was kind of held up as this authority. The science says this, therefore, you need to be in lockdown or whatever. And then it turned out like the government was just like lying about about like the thing for the, just, all of this kind of stuff. What was the specific thing that you got in hot water for around, around the pandemic?
Yeah, so Harper's Magazine, the oldest magazine in the United States, existent magazine, and I had the cover piece in April on it around this issue of the governance during the pandemic being basically a form of scientism. So the standard narrative in the United States is populists aren't listening to experts anymore because they've gone crazy, or because
Okay,
Trump.
and what is a popular? I feel like I hear people accusing other people of being populist, but I never know what it means. What does that mean?
Honestly don't like the term because I don't think it's well defined, but the rough sense I have for the way it works in our political discourse is that people who don't have maybe college credentials or a certain level of education, so the populace in a sense that divides it from educated elites, so the other to the populists are educated elites.
Oh, okay. So the populists are kind of like sort of the riffraff, sort of looked down upon by the educated elites. Kind of that's kind of the vibe.
Yes. And so
Okay, right.
populism is sort of a catch-all for why aren't people listening to the elites anymore when it comes to the economy, or the pandemic, or they're not getting vaccines, disaster. They here in the United States, people don't get, it's become popular amongst some groups to not vaccinate for anything. It's crazy. But my take on this, and this is what caused kind of a little bit of problems. Even the governor of California weighed in on my article actually on it, but because he was annoyed by it. But the standard take is damn populists, like they don't understand science. They need a good moral lecture on science. And in a way, I kind of agree with that, but in a way, I don't agree with that at all, because I think part of what elites need to see is that we often blur the line between what the natural scientists can tell us about a virus, how deadly it is, how it spreads, et cetera, and then claims, at least in the United States, about like what institutions need to shut down. So it was being evoked as though if you had certain viral spread rates, certain fatality rates, certain stress on the hospitals, that meant you couldn't do X, Y, Z, and that would be a mandate from elite representatives in the United States. But there's always a significance question. The data doesn't decide for us what we're willing to die or get sick for. And I think that people without college education sensed that some kind of sleight of hand was being pulled on them, where they were being told science says, I don't know, you can't go to church, or you can't go to the funeral of the person you love. And it had a huge blowback effect, because then what happened is a lot of people took that to mean, well, all of science is bogus, or it fueled an already existing animus that the elites are using science as a vehicle for ideology. So I think that we're in this very toxic cycle right now where elites keep overextending the authority of science, and then populists keep saying, well, to hell with anything elites say, then it must
Right.
all be
Yeah.
stupid. Everything they say must be ideology, which I don't think is true. But
Yeah.
yeah.
What is hermeneutics? Is that for you?
Hermeneutics, yeah. Yeah, hermeneutics is just it's the Greek word for interpretation, and it comes from the Greek god Hermes, who's the messenger god who brings language. And but in philosophy, it's a school that holds that um, human beings are interpreting meaning-making creatures. That what's distinctive about anthropology, I mean, that's a really quick way of what all these things get wrong, is we're hermeneutic creatures. We're meaning-making interpretive creatures, and we dwell in our meanings, and there's always the question of what kind of meanings do we want to make. And I don't mean that in any spooky way. It's like Clifford Geertz, this anthropologist, says, one of the great anthropologists of the 20th century, he says, humans dwell in meanings the way that spiders dwell in webs. I mean, it's just, we make meanings and we live in them. And that's not a question that all the data in the world can decide for you. And it's not a question you can have a science about. Like if I read Hamlet and say, I'm going to give you a data analysis for what it means, you just think I was crazy. But people read social reality in our lives as though it's a much simpler problem than Hamlet. It's just like, I'll give you the data and I'll tell you what it means. And they're missing hermeneutics. That's one of ways to get at what my like little obsession is the ordinary person is living a story and telling stories, and we need to listen to each other's stories more and get better at interpreting them.
And so, like, do we? How do we do that? If we're trying to, for example, if CNN were to were to drink the Jason Kool-Aid and suddenly were to change the way they do like political reporting, like what might that look like if they were to take a more like hermeneutic approach to the thing?
Well, since I'm not a Puritan about statistics, I would still want statistics there, but they would be a lot more long form interviewing. There would be a lot more ethnography about different communities, like what happened in two towns over where you absolutely never go. And so there would be and what's missing there is the stuff we learn in the humanities, which everyone thinks are useless, but which I think are absolutely vital to being a human being, which is the art of interpretation, which is another way to think about hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is the art of interpretation. We can get better and worse at telling stories and understanding stories. I'm not a subjectivist or relativist about meaning. We don't have the same kind of objectivity there that we have in the natural sciences where we just verify something. I mean, that's a simplified view of the natural sciences, but in the natural sciences, a kind of empiricism is more plausible. But yeah, it's like there are some people who are better at interpreting Hamlet, and there's some people that are better at interpreting or telling the story of what's going on with the working class or white women, and and if people drink the Jason Kool-Aid, what would happen is we would have a lot more time to hear the other story and not like some kumbaya thing, and then like, okay, let's debate the rival stories here. Why do you think America's not great anymore? Like, what's behind that story beyond the slogan? Like, what are you saying here? And people might be saying different things because some people are saying something that sounds vaguely white nationalist, but then there's some people who are, like I said, Hispanic or Black working class, who astonishingly are voting MAGA. And it's like, so what does that story mean to you? Like, what exactly are you hearing there that resonates, you know?
Okay.
So how would a normal...
that seems very reasonable. You know,
thank you. Yeah, I think it's quite reasonable.
Less focus on just the data and a little bit more of like, what are the people on the ground actually saying and why do they believe the thing? And like, let's really try and have empathy for the other side to really understand like, what is the story they're telling themselves? Because
narratives,
it's not irrational.
culture.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
It's rational based on their worldview and their circumstances and their stories. So like, let's just understand that.
Yes. And then argue about the story. So I don't mean it to mean like we don't argue. Just let's make sure we're arguing about stories. Because you know what? There's a wonderful book called Rule by Numbers. It is by an academic. It is kind of heady. But I think a lot of what we do is we let our numbers tell our story, and then we think we can shut everyone up because we said something totally objective that you can't interpretively dispute. And that's where we're doing the Psi-op or the sort of superstitious thing is like, numbers are always embedded in stories. And so what we tend to do is think, oh, well, the natural sciences are so wonderful. I'll just give you some numbers or I'll give you some data and I'll rule by that. But what we're always ruling by is some story or some account of what's significant and meaningful. And it's story is a democratic form, small d. Everyone tells stories. Kids love stories. People without, elite educations can tell their story. You have to listen to their story. Story is something you can dispute. Story is contestable. Numbers sound like the elites come down and tell you just what the numbers are and now do what's good for you. Technocracy is the word for that. I'm anti-technocracy. Rule by number crunching wonks. I don't like that. I think it's anti-democratic.
Yeah, I guess the thing is when someone does like share some numbers, they're your takeaway is not the numbers. Your takeaway is a story. If someone shares that, oh, this is correlated with that, certain kinds of people, group A is correlated with, something, then your takeaway is, oh, those people are like that, right? Your takeaway isn't like, oh, well, this is r squared of 0.9 and something like this, right? So right. I guess the Psi-op is kind of like, you're being presented this sort of numbers type of thing. You're going away with a story. And obviously those numbers can be selected or constructed in a way that this person can push their agenda to achieve whatever they want.
Yeah, and in a way, what I saw when I wrote We Built Reality, which I was studying this for years, and what I saw something new, which is I'll just treat everyone like they're telling stories. I mean, if we're meaning-making creatures, then even the social theories are also narrative or cultural. And so I'll just turn the tables. For the longest time, I spent like 10, 15 years just writing immanent critique, like a criticism of why that data model or that that theory, that supposedly scientific theory in political science was wrong. And then in We Built Reality, I just decided, you know what, I'm not going to argue why it's wrong. I'm just going to assume that those are more cultural production and more stories. And so I absolutely agree with that, Tamor, that basically the story, there's always a repressed hermeneutics. You might not know the word hermeneutics, but you are hermeneutical. You are storytelling. You've got a story you're trying to get people to buy into always. It's just, you're kind of trying to short circuit the process by just saying, I'm just giving you the science. Right. And by the way, I should say the natural science revolution discredited storytelling. So like, we think storytelling is a child genre. We think it's something from the primitive Iron Age past, but it's not. You can't get rid of stories. And so that genre, which doesn't look like hard-nosed explanatory, like when I correlate and get up a causation. So I really think it has to do with the deep animus in the modern world toward stories still being around, Like, isn't that just something religious people have? Religious people have stories, or primitive people have stories.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a sense that, the stories thing, it's not objective. It's like, you can't do anything with this thing. It's kind of wishy-washy. Like, yes, some people, in certain circles, they will talk about their stories or whatever. But like, the rest of us who have to, who have business to run, country to manage, et cetera, we can't be dealing with that sort of wishy-washy stuff. But I mean, so we've talked a lot about like, okay, we have this sort of this, scientism, right? That's kind of like the Psi-op is like, hey, science is as it's sort of presented as this very neutral, objective thing, and that really appeals to us. We're like, science has this status in our head. Things involving data and numbers have this status in our head where they command that authority. So, why is scientism the Psi-op du jour rather than whatever else 100 years ago, whatever the Psi-op was like? Why this thing? Where does that come from?
Probably precisely because the natural sciences are so grand and great, and they seem to set the gold standard for what it means to know something. So then everyone has this anxiety that maybe everything needs to be like that, probably, the Psi-op pre-scientific revolution, and still can be religion, can be like, false notions of deity or theology to sort of get you to do things and manipulate you. And I heard a God say X, Y, and Z, and now you have to do that too. But this is the thing that is like kind of my jabbing in the eye of modern people is, by the way, you're not as unsuperstitious as you think. It's just your superstition goes deep. It goes into your overappraisal of science, which ought to be the opposite of superstition. So it's a real blind spot that we're being superstitious precisely in the moment we think we're not being that. And part of what makes it so tricky is what attracts us to it is something good, which is, if there's something modern people are proud of in a short list, science is one of them, or they ought to be proud of it in a way, right? I mean, so I think that's one of the reasons that, and in fact, the book I just wrote on ideologies is about one way people try to say my ideology is right is they just try to say it's science. Like, I have a science of free markets, I have a science of the working class will revolt in London, Paris, and New York next. So people try to scientism. They try to make their ideologies scientific in some ways.
So why, 100 years ago, when the ball had already gotten rolling on like science is amazing and all this kind of stuff, and the rational choice theorists were just kind of coming out and writing their books or whatever. Do you feel, I guess, how long have people like you been, sort of beating this drum? Like, why 100 years ago wasn't someone like, wait, hold up, that's all well and good, but like, we're all about story, hermeneutics, man.
Yeah, they have been, actually. I wish I could say I was the first, or maybe it's a good thing I can say that I'm not the first. There has always been a reaction against this sort of hyper rationalism in our societies. I mean, probably the earliest form is the Romantics, and I love the British Romantic poets, but the idea that poetry is somehow showing us something that the man of reason can't figure out. The notion that the artist has something to tell us that is beyond the data or the statistics. That's a very early reaction. Since these things go back to the scientific revolution, you have all these attempts at sort of a machine view of society that go back to the early Enlightenment, and you have a backlash almost right away. A generation later, you have this sort of overappraisal of rationalism with the Enlightenment guys. They got their white wigs on. They think they got it all figured out. And then you have Romanticism. Everyone's got their hair wild. They're walking around nature, talking poets. So it really comes out of Romanticism through people like Gadamer, Heidegger, Charles Taylor. So there's a tradition that holds that language and so on is really what's key to understanding the human, right? Poetics, that sort of a thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As a bit of a just a random again noob question, why is Charles Taylor such a big deal? Like, what was his shtick in a nutshell?
His shtick in a nutshell is this. It is this. I've taken it in new directions, but I'm in awe of them. I think he's the greatest living philosopher in the English-speaking world. That's my judgment. I'm not the only one who thinks that. Parochialism of being an English speaker, I withhold judgment. The other linguistic traditions might have someone else, but his accomplishments are spectacular, like across the board. And he was once asked, this famous distinction of Isaiah Berlin: is he a fox or a hedgehog intellectually? And a fox is someone who knows a lot of things, and a hedgehog is someone who knows just one thing. And if you read his books, it looks like he knows a ton of things. He's contributed to debates over secularism. He's contributed to debates over multiculturalism. I mean, I could go on and on. But he answered that he's actually secretly like a hedgehog. He knows one thing. What's the one thing he knows? Hermeneutics. He just applies it to all these different realms in ways that are really surprising and profound. It's like to recover the meaning-making dimensions against like other types of ways of thinking about ethical, social, political life. So I really think that is his big breakthrough, if you like, or big idea. He's the most important living representative of what I'm going on about. He's the most important living representative of it.
Yeah, I think the thing that drew me to some of his stuff is that it seems like, I mean, so from what I can see, there's not that many people trying to sort of push back on the dominant narrative of like modernity and what life is all about, basically. There's not that many people trying to sort of unpack that and sort of maybe even push back on that of like, hey, actually, things on the dominant narrative is not as it seems. And it seems like him and Alistair McIntyre are two kind of like people who are kind of like skeptical of the dominant narrative and are trying to sort of unpack the story of like, okay, how did we get here? Is this really, is this sort of the end state? And what's a better explanation for why we're here, and all this kind of stuff.
Absolutely. I think that's right. And they're a weird pair because in some ways they're very different and politically opposed to each other. But you're right to see, Tamor, that they also have deep agreements about, what are human beings and the critique of the role of science in society and whatnot. Yeah, for sure. And anyone who wants to read those, I always say, yeah, absolutely. Like they're tough, but they're really, really rewarding books. I mean, they change my way of looking at things for sure, both of them.
Yeah. I remember a few years ago, I haven't been reading books very long. I basically didn't really read books as a kid. I mean, I spent a lot of time on the internet. I was like reading stuff, right? Like, but I never really like read actual books. I mean, I read like a couple of Harry Potters. I read a few like Twilight series. Ali was always like reading books and fiction and this kind of stuff. I spent a long time on the internet, and even at university, I did maths. So you basically don't need to read any books. You get the lecture notes, a bunch of like math stuff. You can kind of stay in your bubble and just not really get outside of that. And I can't remember who recommended it to me. I think I had a friend who maybe did PPE at university, philosophy, politics, and economics or something. And I think I think I was just having some conversation with him, and he was like, "Oh man, you should read this book. It's called After Virtue by Alistair McIntyre." And I was like, "Okay, I'll buy this book on Kindle." And I'm telling you, Jason, like, this is like 4 or 5 years ago. Like I would lie down to read this book in bed. And like, I had never read sentences so long. I had no, like, it was so impenetrable for me. It was unbelievable. And I'd try and power through. I was like, okay, I'm going to like I'm going to try and understand what's going on here. And like, it was just basically impossible to read. And then I like put it down for a few years. And I think I had to like, increase my reading age up to that level. And I think I'm now, I think maybe like 6 to 12 months ago, I reached the point where, okay, I can read the book lucidly and understand what's going on. But it's really, it's really hard. But I mean, the book came out in like, I think the ideas in the book are like groundbreaking and have sort of completely affected my worldview and changed a lot of stuff for me. But the book came out in I don't know, like 1984 or something. like why has no one, or maybe they have, but like why has no one like popularized it? I mean, someone could just take that. If someone wants to make a bunch of money, I think, I don't know, like just take that book, make it
Mhm.
digestible, popularize those ideas, and like, it's like 30, it's 40 years on. Like, why is it still so unknown and impenetrable outside of the ivory tower?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there have been some attempts to sort of trade some of his ideas into popular form, but they've been disastrous and really stupid, in my opinion. So, like Rod
Oh,
Dreher
really?
did the Benedict option, which is just a tiny part of after virtue, and he turned it into everyone
Oh,
should
okay.
withdraw from civilization. I think Patrick Deneen's Why Liberalism Failed is an effort at sort of, I think he's
Oh, okay.
basically ripping off McIntyre, but in a kind of reactionary way. No one's really got what's really going on there, in my opinion. So there have been some like breakthrough books from the right wing in the United States that basically are ripping off parts of Alistair McIntyre. But McIntyre is very hard to place, politically. He started out
Okay.
as Marxist, and but some certain reactionaries have kind of, but no one has really, yeah, no one's done that, and I don't know why that is. You should do it. You,
Maybe. I mean, I was I think you've got this book about Taylor and McIntyre and
yeah,
anti-naturalism. I feel like that's quite a nice sort of summarization of a lot of the ideas. So I found that really helpful.
that's good. Yeah, it definitely doesn't reach the level of popular, but yes,
Yeah, yeah.
that's
And
a
it
academic.
feels like there's a book that we talked about, this other book, the Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self by, do you know this book?
Mm,
Um,
I would need more.
rather
Oh,
by Carl Trueman.
oh, no, I don't know that book. No.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I think it kind of just, I mean, I find it really interesting because it sort of analyzes, how did we, I mean, it's specifically focused on, hey, why is sexuality the sort of the locus of our identity? Has it become this sort of really concrete, sort of metaphysical reality that kind of, is the fundamental representation of who we are? And like, how do we get to a point where, someone can say, I'm a man who identifies as woman, and that kind of makes sense to people. Like, the
Right.
way we conceptualize these things kind of makes sense. Whereas, 50 years ago, you know, they'd have no idea what you're talking about. And it seems like he's kind of done that for Charles Taylor. I think I think
Okay.
he doesn't even, yeah, he's kind
Oh,
of done that for
okay.
Charles Taylor.
I
But
think I've run into
yeah.
this guy on Twitter. Yeah, he used to be on and he dropped off, didn't he?
Oh, really? I mean, he's like kind of old. I wouldn't imagine he's on Twitter. Yeah, I
Truman?
don't think he's on.
I don't know.
Carl Trueman. Carl Trueman.
I know he's a Protestant theologian, I want to say. Does that
Yes,
sound
yeah,
right?
that's right. Yeah, I think so. Yeah,
He's
yeah.
kind of a balding guy, kind of squinty eyed.
Yeah. Okay, maybe he's on Twitter. Maybe, yeah, maybe I didn't find
No,
him.
he
Maybe he's on
was,
Twitter.
and he dropped off. He dropped off.
Ah,
But I
okay.
didn't. I have not read his work at all, so I need to catch up. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, nice. Okay, so look, how does a normal person navigate the ideological arena, right? You've got psyops left and right. You've got these people pushing data, pushing science, pushing facts on you that have their secret agendas. Like, how are we supposed to look through that and make up our minds about things in an informed way that aligns with our worldview and values without getting pushed into something that we don't actually necessarily believe in or want?
Well, part of what we need to do is kind of what you're describing about the difficult work of becoming better at reading things. Because so the humanities are the crisis of the humanities is partly the crisis of democracy, because in the humanities is where we learn the art of interpretation, at least rightly done. Now, not everyone has humanities access in it or was educated in that way, and I mean, it's wonderful that you kind of self-taught. Tamor. I mean, that's a great thing. But the other thing, maybe a shorter version of it, would just be, look, we're inescapably storytelling creatures. And so part of what we need to do is take people seriously in the way we take ourselves seriously. Like when we want to explain our own actions in ordinary life, we don't reach for some mechanistic correlation for why we did something. We tell a story about it. We tell a story about who we fall in love with. We tell a story about what we bought, even or didn't buy, who we voted for. And we need to sort of afford the same kind of generosity narratively to other people at large. And if we did that, we'd be a lot further down the road than we are right now. I still think the humanities, there's just no way to do it alone. Like, it's a social problem that we're bad at this. But insofar as ordinary people can do something, I think that is something that they can do right away, you know?
So basically, we read the humanities more and try and look at things through the lens of stories. Is that kind of the advice?
Yeah, become better. Realize that storytelling is the central genre for understanding ourselves and understanding other people. You know, and it's something that's not. It's different than science. Like science is grand and great, but it has limits. It has things it can't do. And really, being a human is about discovering what the best story you have on offer, you know, is. You know, it's really an interpretive problem. Existentially, our problem is what's my story? What's the story of my society? What's the story of my life?
Mm.
That's the
Yeah.
central existential problem that absolutely everybody has. You know, whether they're going through a divorce or lost a job or whatever it is, it's a story. It's a that they're living. You know.
Got it. And on a more micro level, like when if you're watching the news or, one of your friends is like, oh, actually, we commented on this in the most recent, a couple of podcasts ago. I sort of observed that, on a lot of other podcasts, obviously not this podcast, on a lot of other podcasts, the sort of the main kind of topic introduction is basically, oh, I read an interesting study that says that men tend to be like this and women tend to be like that. Well, I read an interesting study about X, Y, Z. Like how I think I commented on this episode that basically if someone says I read a study or studies show, I think the best way I can make sense of like the best thing I can do with that information is just ignore the like studies show bit, because like how else do you make sense of it? Like what do you do when you hear about some study?
I usually ask myself the question, like, how far does this go in terms of being a credible description, very, very thin description of social reality? But then what is the person trying to do with it in terms of getting me to sign on board with some sort of account about what I ought to do next or what we ought to do next or what we're,
Oh, okay.
in other words, there tend to
Yeah,
be
yeah.
sort of repressed ethical dimensions to the sort of, the study. It's back to that thing I was saying about rule by numbers. I think oftentimes people evoke studies to try to sort of resolve an ethical problem we have or to exhort, and that's sort
Mm,
of hidden sometimes. That it's an actual exhortation toward what's
yeah.
significant or meaningful. So I always try to ask myself, okay, what's significant or meaningful here? You know, and I don't mean to sound like it's very accommodating to like the current world. I mean, the university would look tremendously different if hermeneutics were central. You know, it would be much more
Mm,
of a humanistic set of disciplines. I'm a humanist, and so it would look very different than the technocratic multiversity that we have. You know, so I don't think that it's a small set of changes necessarily. It just I also believe in being realistic with where people are at right now. And so you got to work with what's there. Where do they recognize these things in their lives,
mm,
you know? And so these
yeah,
are very
yeah.
small steps, but I actually think that it would require cultural transformation away from scientism to have
Mm,
a more kind of aware and defensible humanistic form of society. Because we treat each other like objects is one thing ethically here is since we have this mode technocratically, we treat each other like objects. Scientism encourages
mm.
us to treat people like objects.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one example you gave in the book of this that really kind of stuck with me was that I think it was an example about like a real estate agent. And the real estate agent gets like they're supposed to try and get the best deal they can for the person for whom they're selling the house or whatever. That's kind of the agreement. That's sort of what's understood. They get like a certain percentage fee of like the sale or whatever. And so if that real estate agent decides, oh well, you know what, I can make a bit more money by kind of just ignoring this one client who I've taken on, and their house will sell for kind of a worse price or whatever, but it's a low mat anyway. Kind of ignore them, focus more time on this other client, or something like this. We would think, oh well, that's perfectly rational. It's perfectly that like why would you not do that? Like the incentive structure is you get this percentage fee. Everyone's in agreement about that. Like what is wrong with that? And I think that sort of example where I think that really stuck with me. And actually, there was a situation at work today I won't go into the details of that, but this kind of dilemma also came up where it's like, well, yeah, I mean, if we look at the economic arrangement and the incentive structure, it's like, yeah, sure, we could like do the bad
Right.
thing, like it would be perfectly rational to do. And we have a responsibility to our shareholders and all this stuff. So I'm beholden to make as much money for me as I can. And so my hands are tied. What am I supposed to do but do the bad thing that the incentives would allow me to do, but that I think general very mainstream ethical norms would say actually probably you shouldn't do that thing. So that really stuck with me. And it seems like in situations where money is involved, we seem to go like sort of completely switch into this mode. I think we're kind of like somewhat in that mode all the time, but in situations where there's money involved or we're participants in some kind of market or a transaction, we go completely into that mode where it's like, oh yeah, it's totally fair game for me to basically kind of try and game the system, and I would assume the other guy's trying to game the system as well, because why the hell wouldn't they? Kind of thing.
Right, exactly. And that's a perfect example of the description is actually an exhortation toward moral language or an excuse or a permission slip. And
right.
it's supposed to relieve us of the interpretive problem of, yeah, but what's the significance of this and how ought we to act? And it might be that sometimes you act, in a way that's the efficient, but the sort of authority of economic science there is sort of giving a permission slip to always do the efficient because that's what has to happen. It's the only rational thing that can happen. And in fact, it's predictable that that's what everyone else will do as well, right? So yeah, that's a perfect example of ideology is creeping behind this sort of just supposedly factual account of just what economics is, right?
Yeah. Are there any thoughts before we move on to sort of final set of topic areas?
No, it's an intriguing conversation, and I knew basically zilch about this going into it. So yeah, appreciate that, Tamar. You read the book and invited Jason on. So I feel much more educated about the topic.
That's great. Yeah. So Jason, like, why did you get into this? Like in particular, like, yeah, what sort of sparked this as the kind of your shtick?
I think I grew up in a very political household. My mom's from Colombia and my dad's American, and my dad, English speaker, my mom a Spanish speaker, and there was a lot of lost in translation in the household. My dad's very anti-religious. My mom's Catholic. Their politics don't always align. And so I wanted to study politics and philosophy as a young person. And then when I started studying it, it was like it was a vampire had drained all the blood and guts out of politics. I was just studying data and models and formal systems. And I thought, what the heck happened to politics? I mean, I have this experience of politics is this thick linguistic cultural thing. And then here I'm told that the way to study it, the sanctioned way to study it is this thin way. And so I always felt like there was something really missing. The ethical dimensions, the kind of cry of justice, even if you like, the sort of thick labyrinthine misunderstandings, that's very autobiographical, but kind of feeling stuck always as a bilingual household between two cultures, two languages, explaining my mother to my father and my father to my mother and never being able to actually successfully do that. So, I had this problem that was sort of existential, and then the sort of disappointment with the academic study of politics, like that can't possibly be everything,
Okay. And then you found this sort of enclave of hermeneutists or whatever, and
yes. I found a language and a philosophical tradition that could eliminate or make sense of some of the things that I saw as limitations, Yeah, definitely. And, I was the kind of person, I read too many books, Tamer. I had the opposite problem. It's like, put the book down, like interact with reality. So I was like, binging literature, history, philosophy, when in my early 20s, like almost like a unhealthy thirst or hunger. Is probably competitive too. It was a very intellectually competitive thing. So I think that the sort of I was always sort of very attracted to the humanities. I still think the best psychologists are actually novelists. Henry James, Dostoevsky. Those are the greatest psychologists we have. Not Skinner, or, even Freud. They get that better. And so I think that's where it came out of. I was always attracted to the humanities, and
nice. For someone who isn't sort of a priori attracted to the humanities, I feel like I'm kind of getting it now. I wouldn't have been interested, like particularly interested, like when I was in secondary school, probably for most of university as well. Um, can you sort of briefly make? I mean, I guess this whole podcast has kind of been making a case for why, but like, how does someone kind of dip their toe in the water? I know you're a big like Shakespeare guy. Like we did some Shakespeare in school. We watched some plays and stuff. It's just completely lost on me. I don't understand the significance and the profundity of it if I like go watch, Romeo and Juliet at the Globe in London or something.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, I think it should just start from one's own life, really. I mean, it should really start existentially. Like, sooner or later, people have a meaning problem. You can suppress it for a while, but everyone has this existential kind of thing breathing on them, and
okay.
you just wait for life to spring it on you. I mean, I'd be curious in that sense, Tamor, why you picked up After Virtue. It's one thing for a friend to tell you read this. It's another thing to actually
Yeah.
try, fail, try again. I mean,
Yeah.
there has to be something pressing on you
Yeah. Yeah.
in life, not asking you to divulge, but you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah. I'm trying to think back. Like, what was that? Yeah. I
the
can't remember.
the philosopher Richard Rorty says, like, arguments don't help me if I'm sick and dying in the hospital. Like a
Right. Yeah.
story, a line of poetry, some consolation of meaning,
Mm.
not as a mind trick, but because our problem is a meaning problem and we need something that corresponds to the meaning deficit. You can sit
Mm.
there, doctors can do wonderful things to you, etc. But like, some people die well and some people die absolutely petrified and scared and not ready.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
like, those are meaning problems and everyone has those. So, Shakespeare's not for everyone. I absolutely adore Shakespeare. You're right. But meaning is for everyone and stories are for everyone. So like, like you said, you read Harry Potter, you read, if you don't have a story, then you'll find just a deficient one, right? You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
you won't evade the story thing. It'll be
Yeah.
there, so that would be more my take, is to press people existentially. I'm not an elitist about, but everyone has
Yeah.
a favorite movie, a favorite
Ah.
song, or a
Yeah.
favorite,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the thing that prompted me to get interested in this is, I'm a Muslim. I'm practicing. I aspire to be, religious and pious and all of this kind of stuff. And I think growing up as like a practicing Muslim in the West, I mean, I think the general sort of narrative around religion as a whole is like, this is like backwards, this is bad, stuck in the past. We now know that these things aren't true. Science, the whole like science versus religion psyop. I think there's I think it felt like during university, during secondary school, there's so many narratives around sort of religion and its place in sort of the modern Western world, and the narrative is very it's a very sort of directional narrative. It's like, hey, really, it's kind of part of the sort of general progress narrative, which I think is another big psyop of like, everything in the past was worse. We're getting better at everything, and look at all the scientific advances. And like naturally, obviously, that means everything is getting better, et cetera, et cetera. And people in the past were stupid, and like religion is something for your grandparents and stuff like this. And it's nice that they go to church and they have their community, or go to the mosque, and that's really nice for them. But we've kind of moved on, sort of thing. And so I think that was kind of the dominant narrative. And I think, as someone who is a sort of practicing religious person in the West, I think there's a certain sort of malaise that comes with that. And I think I sort of had some thoughts around this, and I can't remember exactly how this friend ended up recommending it, but I think we'd have conversations about this kind of stuff. He's like, oh man, you should read this book. I think that's kind of how it
Mm-hmm.
came about.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I talk in Weeble Reality about the levels of depression, and some depression, fine, it might be a scientific cause, but people aren't allowed to ask the significance question around depression. It's not that, oh, you find God or you find Allah or you find, and then you're cured of your sadness. But there's a depoliticization and a despiritualization of the malaise of depression, etc. And so people are being cut off from long-standing narratives that make a bid on like the best account of human existential conundrums. And so greatly impoverished to sort of face life, adversity, etc. Because I mean, that's another way at it, is like wisdom is not the same as science. Wisdom is in my view, is a narrative accumulation. Like Islam has wisdom in it. I recognize it, even though I'm not Muslim. I recognize Islam has wisdom. But if your view is stories can't teach me anything, they all come from the pre-scientific age, you're really setting yourself up existentially for some very, I used to be an atheist, for some very some difficulty if you take it seriously. And I think sooner or later you have to. It might not be till your last breath, but So I would say you cut yourself off from wisdom in some senses if you cut yourself off from self-awareness about story.
Mm. Yeah, I feel like wisdom it's not a word that we hear too much nowadays. Well, it's almost like the new wisdom is like something couched in, studies have shown that you should do X, Y, and Z kind of thing. That's like the new source of wisdom. It's like, yeah, that's a new oracle or whatever.
Yeah, the AI is wise.
Yeah, exactly. Nice.
Yeah, it's funny that you guys are talking like. I vividly remember having this feeling when we started this podcast. I think it was in like 2019 or something, where it ended up in the society and culture section of the podcast apps, podcast store platforms, whatever it was. And I remember thinking, society and culture, like who cares? who gives a shit about society? Like, the only category that matters is business. Like, why is anyone like business and fiction? Why is anyone listening to shit outside of business and fiction? Like, fiction is like cool stories, fantasy, Harry Potter, Brandon Sanderson, Twilight, and business is like how you make money.
Right.
And sort of slowly over time, I don't think I'm quite at the place where Tamor is yet, but I've started to feel a bit of the meaning deficit, especially after achieving the financial goals and all that shit. That now like the thing I have on my bucket list is, I'd really love to get into philosophy, because like I feel like people have been trying to think about this stuff for ages, and I'm just now realizing, I'll have a thought or something, and I'll say it to a friend who's like educated in the humanities, and they'll be like, "Oh yeah, Plato wrote about this in The Cave." I'm like, "Oh, cool. Which cave was that?" That kind of thing. And so I'm slowly scratching the surface of this sort of stuff, but Tame was a few years ahead of me.
Nice. Final. I know this has been going on a while, and I know you have a theater performance to get to, Jason. But I'd be curious. It would be interesting just to hear a little bit about like the sort of behind the scenes of like academia. Like who are the powers that sort of say, "Oh yes, Jason, We Built Reality is a good idea for a book." Your next thing, Lost in Ideology. This is a good book, and like. Yeah, I guess like what's been sort of the reception, because obviously these are kind of more academic ideas, like sort of against the orthodoxy. Like, yeah, how does that stuff work behind the scenes, and how do you feel like your shtick is doing out in the public? Is it getting traction? Yeah.
Yeah, I was surprised. I mean, I think We Built Reality did a lot more people are interested than I expected, which
nice.
Is humbling. There's no behind the scenes that, at least academia in the United States, I can speak to. It's you don't really have a boss. I mean, there are division chairs and administrators, but because of the emphasis on intellectual freedom, which is what's behind like, tenure and things like that, you're the expert in your field, and you can get it wrong in the sense of your peers can say that's bad, or we're not interested, or we're not going to cite that, or we're not going to publish that. There's peer review to, like We Built Reality is published with Oxford Press, which, my peers tend to just applaud at that, even if they think the book is crap, because it's Oxford, so it's not like there are no checks, but I basically do whatever I want, I get to teach. I enjoy teaching, but, so I have things I need to do for my job. But the publishing is basically self-directed. There is no behind the scenes. It's just me kind of doing things. And then, it's led to wonderful things like, getting to go celebrate Charles Taylor's birthday in Vienna came out of We Built Reality because he really liked the book. So something academics do when someone turns 90 or 100 is they call it a Festschrift, where they basically you write essays for them, which sounds like a really boring way to spend time, but academics love it. So we all wrote essays for Taylor, and he was there. And So the book has been really just a surprise and humbling that people find that it resonates. But yeah, I guess that I don't have any behind the scenes thing to really offer in that sense. Yeah.
Oh, okay. But surely, like, if you're publishing a book, surely Oxford Press is going to think, oh, what will the market that sort of what will
Oh,
the
for
market
sure.
think of the
They
book,
think
right?
that. Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. Yeah, but I don't think about that stuff because, as you can tell, I'm kind of hostile to it, which is how you end up an academic, right? But they care about that. They seem happy enough with it. They're like, wow, this thing's it's sold well in the United States. I
Oh, nice.
have
Okay.
no idea how it's doing in the UK, but it's done well in the United States for the kind of book it is,
Yeah.
So yeah.
Nice. And
Nice.
I've just pre-ordered Lost in Ideology. What
Oh,
is that
thank you.
about for people who, because it's coming out in March, so actually, yeah,
it's pretty
people,
soon.
or April in the UK apparently. Yeah, what's it about, and like what's the pitch for the book?
The pitch for the book is that it's basically a theory of ideology that is taking seriously its meaning-making features and how ideology is actually experienced by the people who hold an ideology, whatever that ideology might be. And so part of it is just a tour or handbook of all the major ideologies, because I think people don't understand the other person's ideology very well because we put it on mute. So each chapter is an exploration of the major ideological traditions in our societies. But part of it is this thing I've been going on about, which is I have a theory of ideology that's hermeneutic, that ideologies are world making and cultural, and you can objectively say an ideology is false if it says it's a science or it's just mere nature or it's mere common sense. And so I have this theory of ideology that both claims to be better descriptively of what ideology actually is in the world, its meaning, its culture. It has these first person features, but it's also critical. So like I can get rid of certain mutations of ideological traditions when they make the move towards saying they're scientific. Whoop, did I lose you guys? Am I back?
You did, but you are back. Yeah. So if you could repeat that last sentence.
Yeah. So the last thing I said is just that the book tries to both be more true to actual ideological experience, what it's like to have an ideology, its meaning features, and also to be still critical and be able to criticize objectively ideologies that claim to be science and not be able to account for their own cultural features, scientific forms of ideology, which I think all the major ideologies have scientific branches from left to right.
Nice. I think it feels like now is the right moment for a book like this, and I think the front cover is amazing. Like it's kind of got this sort of like made. Oh, maybe you can show it to us. So good. So it's just like, yeah,
I love it. I wish I could take credit. Yeah, one of the major metaphors in the book is that ideology is like a labyrinth, and this guy Nick Halliday, English, he made it, and it's lovely. I mean, he just went way beyond. I just said, "Could you do a labyrinth?" And yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm really happy with it. Can't take credit. Yeah.
Nice, awesome. Cool. I think we'll wrap it up there. Jason, thank you so much for joining us. Excited for the new book. I'll keep trying to spread the good word over here in the UK for We Built Reality.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I've really appreciated our DMs, and I appreciate meeting your brother. You guys are a real good pair. I watched some of your episodes. Good report
nice.
to you. Yeah, I really like
it.
it.
I think it would have been we try to sort of do these things in person, because I think there's always a bit of a delay on like video call and stuff like this. But yeah, maybe next time you're in London, we can sit around a table and do another podcast in person.
Oh, I would love that. I love London. What a great city. You're lucky you're there. Yeah.
Awesome. Cool.
Sweet.
Thanks a lot. Thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you guys.
And,
Thanks.
we'll see you next week.
Take care. Bye.